The morning sun filtered through the canopy of live oaks draped in Spanish moss, casting dappled light onto the cobblestone streets of Savannah's historic district. It was a sight Ophelia Marlowe had never grown tired of, even after a lifetime here. The air smelled faintly of salt from the nearby river, mingling with the intoxicating aroma of roses, lavender, and freesia wafting from the open doors of Bloom Haven, the flower shop she had called home since she was a little girl. Inside, the shop was a symphony of colors and textures. Shelves filled with antique vases, jars of dried petals, and bundles of flowers arranged with an artistry that seemed almost magical. Ophelia moved through the space with practiced ease, her hands deftly arranging a bouquet of yellow tulips and baby's breath. The shop wasn't just a business. It was a legacy, a tangible memory of her mother's dreams and hard work. Every corner told a story. Every flower spoke a silent language her mother had taught her. "Yellow tulips for hope," she murmured, tucking a sprig of green into the bouquet. Her voice was soft but carried the weight of her resolve. Hope was something she clung to these days, even as uncertainty loomed. "Morning, Miss Marlowe," called a familiar voice. It was Mrs. Clara Pritchard, the neighborhood's unofficial matriarch, her hands clutching a basket filled with peaches. The older woman's presence was as comforting as a well-loved quilt. "I brought you something sweet to start your day." Ophelia smiled, grateful for the gesture. "Thank you, Mrs. Clara. You always know how to make a girl's day brighter." As they chatted, neighbors trickled in and out, sharing stories, laughter, and kind words. This was the heartbeat of the community, a place where people felt seen, heard, and valued. For Ophelia, the shop was more than a business. It was a refuge, a symbol of unity in a rapidly changing world. The mood shifted when Ellie, her young assistant, rushed in holding a crisp envelope. "Ophelia, this came for you. It looks important." Ophelia wiped her hands on her apron, a knot of unease forming in her stomach as she took the envelope. The logo at the top, Whitaker Industries, sent a chill through her. Tearing it open, she read the letter quickly, her heart sinking with every word. The letter was clear. The property Bloom Haven stood on had been targeted for redevelopment. Whitaker Industries planned to demolish the shop and replace it with part of a sprawling luxury complex. Her hands trembled as she folded the letter, the weight of the words pressing down on her. For a moment, the familiar warmth of the shop seemed to dim, replaced by a creeping sense of dread. Losing Bloom Haven would mean losing not just her livelihood, but also the memories, the history, and the essence of the community it represented. Mrs. Clara's brow furrowed as she took Ophelia's hand. "What is it, dear?" Ophelia forced a steady breath. "They're trying to take the shop, turn it into part of some development." The older woman's eyes flashed with indignation. "Not on my watch," she declared. "We'll fight this, Ophelia. You're not alone." The words were a comfort, but Ophelia knew the battle ahead would be an uphill one. Whitaker Industries was a giant, its reach extending far beyond their small neighborhood. Still, she refused to let despair take root. Instead, determination began to bloom, fragile but growing stronger by the second. Later that evening, after the shop had closed and the streets outside were quiet, Ophelia sat at her workbench, the letter still on the table beside her. She sifted through her mother's old scrapbook, filled with clippings, notes, and pressed flowers. Her mother had faced hardships too, but she had always found a way to persevere. As Ophelia turned the page, a slip of paper fluttered to the ground. It was an invitation, gilded and ornate, addressed to Ms. Marlowe. Her eyes widened as she read, "The Mare Daurada Gala, an exclusive annual event hosted by Savannah's elite." The date was this Saturday. The idea sparked almost instantly. This was her chance. She could already hear her mother's voice in her mind. "When you're fighting for what's right, don't be afraid to stand where they least expect you." With a resolve as firm as the roots of an ancient magnolia, Ophelia made her decision. She would go to the gala, walk among the rich and powerful, and make them see what Bloom Haven truly stood for. This fight wasn't just about a flower shop. It was about preserving a way of life, a sanctuary for memories and dreams. The hook was set, and Ophelia knew there was no turning back. As she carefully placed the invitation on her workbench, Her gaze shifted to the bouquet of yellow tulips she'd finished earlier. Hope. It was time to bloom where she was planted. Morning sunlight spilled through the tall windows of Bloomhaven, painting the floorboards in golden streaks. Ophelia worked quietly behind the counter, her fingers nimbly tying a ribbon around a bouquet of hydrangeas. Despite the serene exterior of the shop, a quiet storm brewed within her. The letter from Whitaker Industries weighed on her mind like a dark cloud. "Ellie, could you check on the carnations?" Ophelia called out. The young assistant emerged from the back room, her curly hair tied back with a bright scarf that matched her vibrant personality. "They're perfect, just like you said they'd be," Ellie replied with a wide grin, holding up a few stems for inspection. "How do you always know?" Ophelia couldn't help but smile. "The flowers tell you everything if you pay attention." Ellie's admiration was almost tangible. "I swear, you're like a flower whisperer. One day, I'm going to be just as good as you." "You'll be better," Ophelia said, her voice warm. Ellie's enthusiasm was contagious, a bright spot amidst the growing shadows. The doorbell jingled, announcing Mrs. Clara Pritchard's arrival. Dressed in her usual pastel blouse and pearls, the elderly woman carried a basket of muffins, her sharp eyes scanning the shop as if taking inventory of its every detail. "Ophelia, darling, I brought something to keep you going," Clara said, setting the basket on the counter. "You'll need your strength for what's ahead." Ophelia glanced at Clara, reading the deeper meaning behind her words. "You heard already? Savannah's a small place, dear. News travels faster than the river current." Clara's tone was laced with determination. "You're not facing this alone." Ellie nodded fervently. "We'll all fight with you." As they spoke, the door opened again, revealing Mr. Benton, the owner of the antique shop down the street. His expression was conflicted as he lingered near the entrance. "Morning, Benton," Clara greeted, her tone pointed. He gave a hesitant nod. "Morning, Ophelia. Could I have a word?" Clara's eyes narrowed, but Ophelia nodded. "Of course." Benton approached, twisting his cap in his hands. "Look, I know what that letter means to you." "I do. But they've offered a good sum for my place. I can't ignore it." Ophelia's heart sank. "You'd leave?" "It's not just for me," he said, avoiding her gaze. "It's for my family. Times are tough." Ophelia placed a hand on the counter to steady herself. She understood his reasons, but it didn't make the sting any less painful. Clara spoke up, her voice firm. "Selling might help now, Benton, but what about the future? What happens when they've turned this place into something we don't recognize?" The words hung in the air, unspoken questions Ophelia would need to answer herself. As Benton shuffled out, Ophelia took a deep breath. "This fight just got harder." Clara squeezed her shoulder. "But you've got roots, Ophelia. Strong ones. Don't forget that." Ophelia nodded, feeling both the weight of the challenge ahead and the quiet support of those standing with her. Together, they would have to find a way to weather the storm. The Mare Daurada Gala was a spectacle of opulence. The ballroom glittered with golden chandeliers, their light reflecting off polished floors and the sequins of extravagant gowns. Waiters in crisp uniforms weaved through the crowd, balancing trays of champagne flutes. Ophelia Marlowe lingered near the entrance, her fingers brushing the fabric of her simple, emerald green dress. It was a hand-me-down, yet it carried an elegance that came from the memories stitched into it, a quiet homage to her mother's love for understated beauty. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, each click of her heels echoing louder in her mind than in the crowded room. Eyes followed her, curious but dismissive. She didn't belong here, and she knew it. But that wasn't why she'd come. She had a purpose, a resolve rooted as deeply as the flowers she tended. "Miss Marlowe, isn't it?" A smooth voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find a man in a tailored black suit, his stance both casual and commanding. He was striking, with sharp features and piercing gray eyes that seemed to assess her instantly. Thorne Whitaker. Her grip on her clutch tightened. She forced a polite smile, though her voice held steel. "And you must be Mr. Whitaker, the one and only," he replied, his tone laced with an arrogance that set her teeth on edge. "I didn't expect to see you here. Not your usual crowd, I assume?" Ophelia raised an eyebrow, the hint of a challenge sparking in her gaze. You're right. My usual crowd values substance over spectacle. The corners of his mouth twitched, an almost smile betraying his amusement. Touché. Still, I can't help but wonder, what brings a florist to an event like this? Looking for donors for a flower arrangement fund? Her shoulders stiffened, but she met his condescension head-on. I'm here because I care about more than profits and polished surfaces, Mr. Whitaker. Unlike some, I believe communities are worth fighting for. The heat in her voice silenced him for a moment, his gray eyes narrowing slightly. Thorne was used to people deferring to him, flattering him. But this woman, this florist, had just publicly called him out, and her passion struck a chord he wasn't prepared to acknowledge. As Ophelia turned on her heel, leaving him standing in the center of the ballroom, Thorne felt something he hadn't in a long time. Intrigue. He found himself watching her retreat, the air still charged from their exchange. The night ended, but her words lingered, carving out a space in his thoughts. For the first time, Thorne Whitaker wondered if the fight his family was waging wasn't as justified as he'd been led to believe. The next morning, Ophelia was back in the comforting hum of Bloomhaven. The shop's doors were wide open, inviting the neighborhood in with the heady aroma of fresh blooms. Ophelia worked quietly, her hands arranging a display of sunflowers that seemed to radiate the energy she desperately needed. Despite her focus, the tension from the previous night still weighed heavily on her. The familiar chime of the doorbell broke her concentration. Looking up, she froze. Thorne Whitaker stood in the entryway, his polished appearance starkly out of place among the rustic charm of the flower shop. His gaze swept over the space, lingering on the rows of colorful arrangements before settling on her. Mr. Whitaker, she said, her voice even but cool. To what do I owe the pleasure? Call me Thorne, he said smoothly, stepping further inside. His eyes wandered, studying the shop's warmth and character. I was curious. After our conversation last night, I wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Ophelia crossed her arms. Curiosity or an agenda? His lips curved into a slight smirk, but it didn't reach his eyes. Can it be both? Before she could respond, Ellie emerged from the back room, a tray of small potted plants in her hands. Her eyes widened at the sight of their visitor. Oh, good morning, she stammered, her cheeks flushing. Ellie, this is Mr. Whitaker, Ophelia said, keeping her tone measured. He's involved with the project we discussed. Ellie shot Ophelia a worried glance before giving Thorne a quick nod and retreating to the back, leaving the two alone in the shop. Thorne wandered toward a shelf lined with pressed flower arrangements. You've built something remarkable here, he said, his tone uncharacteristically sincere. It's no wonder the community seems to revolve around this place. It's more than a shop, Ophelia said firmly. It's a home, not just for me, but for everyone who comes here. Something in her voice struck a chord, and Thorne turned to face her fully. That's what I don't understand. Why would my father? Why would we target this place specifically? Ophelia frowned. You don't know? Before he could press further, the shop door opened again, admitting a sharply dressed man Ophelia didn't recognize. He walked directly to Thorne, lowering his voice. We need to talk. Ophelia caught a fragment of their hurried conversation as they stepped outside. It's about Victor, the man whispered. It's not just business. It's personal. Thorne's expression darkened as the words hung in the air. He glanced back toward Ophelia through the glass door, something unresolved flickering in his eyes, before he turned and left. The familiar hum of Bloomhaven felt different today, quieter, almost hesitant. Ophelia sat behind the counter, thumbing through a stack of notes left by neighbors pledging support for her fight. The gestures were kind, but their promises now felt fragile. She'd heard whispers at the market earlier that morning. Families considering Whitaker Industries' offers, tempted by sums they couldn't easily refuse. Her thoughts were interrupted when Mrs. Clara entered, her usual briskness replaced by an uncharacteristic hesitancy. Ophelia, I heard Benton's taken the offer. Packed up his shop yesterday. Ophelia's chest tightened. Benton had been a cornerstone of the neighborhood, one of the first to rally behind her cause. I thought he had more time, she said softly, her voice betraying the weight of the news. Clara sighed, setting a small bouquet of daisies on the counter. They're applying pressure, sweetheart. Not everyone has your resolve. Or your roots. The words lingered as Ophelia walked Clara to the door, her gaze trailing after the older woman as she disappeared down the cobblestone street. She was about to lock the door when a shadow fell across the entryway. Leaving so soon? Thorne Whitaker stood there, his suit jacket slung over one shoulder, his tie slightly loosened. He looked more human than the man she'd met at the gala, but his presence still set her on edge. Some of us have long days, she replied. Her tone clipped. He raised an eyebrow, but stepped inside anyway, his eyes scanning the shop with an air of curiosity. I came to see how things were. Progressing. You mean falling apart? Ophelia said, crossing her arms. He winced, his usual smugness replaced by a flicker of guilt. It's not supposed to be like this. Then why is it? Her voice was sharp, but there was a hint of exhaustion beneath it. You say you don't agree with what's happening, but you're still here. Still part of it. Thorne hesitated, the silence between them heavy. It's complicated, he finally said, running a hand through his hair. You think I have a choice in this? I think you're rich enough to make your own choices, Ophelia countered, her eyes narrowing. For a moment, something vulnerable passed over his face. It's not always about money, he said quietly. You wouldn't understand. She leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. Then make me understand. But instead of answering, Thorne turned toward the door, pausing as though he wanted to say more. Not everything is as simple as it seems, he murmured before leaving, his words trailing behind him like a question Ophelia wasn't sure she wanted the answer to. As the door shut, Ophelia stood in the middle of her shop, her resolve shaken but still intact. She was starting to see cracks in Thorne's carefully constructed facade. The question was whether they mattered, or if he was just another part of the problem. The shop was quiet except for the gentle rustle of petals as Ophelia worked on an elaborate floral arrangement. The warm scent of roses and eucalyptus filled the air, wrapping the room in a comforting cocoon. She didn't hear the door chime until Thorne's voice cut through the stillness. I hope I'm not interrupting, he said, stepping inside. Ophelia looked up, her hands still holding a delicate sprig of baby's breath. You're always interrupting, she replied, her tone lighter than she expected. She wasn't sure if she was growing used to his appearances or if the tension between them was softening. Thorne moved closer, eyeing the table laden with flowers in every shade imaginable. Busy day? Every day is busy, she said, her hands deftly weaving stems together. But some things are worth the effort. Let me help, he offered, surprising her. She blinked, uncertain whether he was serious. You want to help me arrange flowers? Her voice held a note of skepticism. Why not? He replied with a slight shrug, rolling up his sleeves. I'm capable of following instructions. She handed him a cluster of daisies, watching as his long fingers fumbled with the stems. Start with these. Keep them even, and don't crush the petals. His attempts were clumsy at first, but Ophelia resisted the urge to laugh. Instead, she leaned over, her hands guiding his. Like this, she said softly, her voice uncharacteristically gentle. Their fingers brushed, and for a moment, the air between them shifted, subtle but undeniable. What do daisies mean? Thorne asked, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. Purity. Innocence, she replied, her focus still on the bouquet. They remind me of simpler times. And these? He asked, holding up a sprig of lavender. Calm. Healing, she said, pausing. My mother used to add lavender to every bouquet. She said it brought peace. Thorne's expression softened as he looked at the flowers in his hands. She sounds remarkable. She was, Ophelia replied, her voice tinged with both sadness and pride. She built this shop with nothing but hope and determination. It's why I can't let it go. Thorne was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the bouquet they were creating together. I used to think all this, he gestured to the flowers and the shop, was just sentimentality. But I see it now. It's more than that, isn't it? It's everything, Ophelia said simply. The vulnerability in her voice struck him, and Thorne felt a pang of guilt. His world had always been defined by power and ambition, but here, in this small shop filled with color and life, he was beginning to question everything he thought he knew. "Do you ever think about walking away?" he asked suddenly. "From all of this?" Ophelia looked at him, her brow furrowing. "Never. It's not just about me. It's about the people who come here, the memories, the community. Why would I give that up?" Thorne nodded, but his expression was distant, as though wrestling with something she couldn't see. She touched his arm lightly, drawing his attention back to her. "What about you?" she asked. "Do you ever think about walking away?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but it's complicated. My family, there are expectations, responsibilities. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is let go," she said, her voice softer now. "But maybe it's the only way to find what really matters." Thorne didn't reply immediately. Instead, he reached for another flower, a single red rose, and added it to the arrangement. "What about this one?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "Love," Ophelia said, a faint blush rising in her cheeks. "Passion." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the room seemed to shrink around them. The intensity in his gaze was disarming, and she felt her breath catch. "Then I suppose it belongs here," he said, placing the rose carefully in the bouquet. His voice was steady, but there was something in his expression, something unguarded, that left Ophelia unsettled in a way she couldn't quite define. The spell broke as the door chime rang again, signaling a customer's arrival. Thorne straightened, his hands moving instinctively to smooth his sleeves. Ophelia turned back to the bouquet, her fingers trembling slightly. As he made his way to the door, Thorne paused. "Thanks for the lesson," he said, his voice lighter now, though his eyes still held that same intensity. "I'll see you around." Ophelia nodded, watching him leave. When the door closed behind him, she looked down at the bouquet they'd made together, her thoughts swirling like the petals in her hands. For the first time, she wondered if Thorne Whitaker might be more than an adversary, and if that was something she should be afraid of. The tension in the air was palpable as Thorne walked into his father's towering office. The Whitaker Industries headquarters loomed over Savannah like a steel and glass titan, a stark contrast to the charm of the historic district it sought to transform. Thorne's steps echoed down the marble hallway, his jaw clenched as he prepared for yet another confrontation. Victor Whitaker sat behind his massive desk, a portrait of control and authority. His sharp eyes narrowed the moment Thorne entered. "You're late," Victor said, his tone clipped. "Traffic," Thorne replied evenly, though they both knew it wasn't true. He took a seat without being invited, bracing himself. Victor wasted no time. "The redevelopment project is falling behind schedule. We've been too lenient. The community needs to understand that resistance is futile." Thorne fought to keep his expression neutral. "Is this about the delays or about sending a message?" "It's about results," Victor snapped. "And you, Thorne, are part of the solution. That florist, what's her name? Marlowe? She's the center of this nonsense. If you don't handle her, I will." The words ignited a spark of defiance in Thorne. "Handle her," he repeated. "She's not some problem to be eliminated. She's a nuisance," Victor interrupted. "And if you're too distracted to see that, perhaps I should reassign this project to someone more capable." Thorne's fists clenched under the table. "I'll take care of it," he said through gritted teeth, though the words tasted bitter. Victor leaned back, satisfied. "Good. Remember, Thorne, our family's legacy is built on strength, not sentiment." Meanwhile, Ophelia paced inside Bloomhaven, her stomach in knots. Overnight, an anonymous flyer had appeared in mailboxes throughout the neighborhood, accusing her of running an unprofitable, outdated business and claiming her resistance to the redevelopment was selfish. The accusations were baseless, but they stung. Ellie burst into the shop, waving one of the flyers. "Did you see this? It's disgusting. Everyone knows it's a lie." Ophelia exhaled shakily. "Not everyone," she murmured. "Some people will believe it." Mrs. Clara soon arrived, her face flushed with indignation. "We won't stand for this, Ophelia. The whole neighborhood knows this is Whitaker Industries trying to bully you." As if to prove her point, a group of neighbors began gathering outside the shop, many carrying baskets of flowers and signs that read, "Save Bloomhaven" and "Community over Corporations." The sight of their support brought tears to Ophelia's eyes. The crowd buzzed with energy as they planned a community event to showcase the shop's importance. Someone suggested a bake-off, while another neighbor proposed a flower arranging contest. Why not both? Ellie chimed in, her enthusiasm lighting up the room. We'll call it the Bloomhaven Block Party. The idea took root quickly, and soon plans were underway. Neighbors spilled into the shop, brainstorming and laughing as they worked. Ophelia couldn't help but smile at their quirky antics. Mr. Benton, who had been wavering in his support, showed up with a plate of cookies, muttering about how they'd probably need dessert. Mrs. Clara enlisted 2 teenagers to paint signs, though their artistic interpretations left something to be desired. The mishmash of efforts was chaotic but endearing. Amid the laughter and flurry of activity, Ophelia felt a moment of peace. The community's love and loyalty reminded her of why she fought so hard. But beneath her resolve, doubt still simmered. Was she leading them toward victory, or setting them up for disappointment? Thorne arrived later that evening, standing at the edge of the crowd. He hadn't planned to come but found himself drawn to the lively scene. Children chased each other between tables, and neighbors laughed over shared meals. The energy was infectious, even to him. He spotted Ophelia arranging flowers at one of the tables and made his way over. "Looks like you've got a whole army behind you," he said. She glanced up, her surprise fading into guarded curiosity. "What are you doing here?" "Observing," he said lightly. "It's different from what I expected." "Most things are," she replied, her tone wary but not unkind. "Are you here to take notes for your father's next smear campaign?" Thorne winced. "That wasn't me." "Maybe not, but you're still part of it," she said, her voice sharp. "If you don't agree with what he's doing, why are you here?" He hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. "It's complicated, but not everything he says represents me." Ophelia studied him, her expression softening slightly. "Then maybe it's time you decide who you really are." Her words struck him harder than he expected, and for a moment, he was at a loss. Before he could respond, Ellie called for her, holding up a tray of cupcakes in triumph. Ophelia turned to leave, but not before glancing back at Thorne. "Enjoy the party, Mr. Whitaker. If you're staying, you might as well make yourself useful." Thorne watched her disappear into the crowd, his chest tight with the weight of her challenge. The lines he'd drawn for himself were blurring, and for the first time, he wasn't sure where he stood, or where he wanted to. The Bloomhaven Block Party had left the shop buzzing with renewed energy, but as the laughter faded and the last of the decorations were packed away, a quieter tension settled over Ophelia. She sat at her workbench late into the evening, her hands idly sorting through dried flowers while her mind replayed the day's events. Despite the community's outpouring of support, a gnawing unease lingered, fueled by the persistent meddling of Whitaker Industries. The familiar creak of the shop door startled her. She turned to find Mrs. Clara stepping in, clutching a folder in one hand. The older woman's expression was unusually grim. "Mrs. Clara? What's wrong?" Ophelia asked, setting the flowers aside. Clara hesitated before pulling up a chair across from her. "There's something I need to tell you, dear. Something I should have said sooner." Ophelia leaned forward, sensing the weight of her words. "What is it?" Clara placed the folder on the table, her hand lingering on it as though reluctant to let go. "Years ago, before you were born, I worked for Victor Whitaker's father. Back then, the Whitaker family was just starting to expand into Savannah. They were ruthless, even then." Ophelia's brow furrowed. "What does this have to do with now?" Clara exhaled, her voice heavy with regret. "Your mother and I grew up together, you know. We were like sisters. When I started working for the Whitakers, I saw firsthand how they operated. They'd buy out properties for pennies on the dollar, using any means necessary. Your mother's family owned a small apothecary shop, not unlike this one. It was her parents' pride and joy." Ophelia's breath caught. "What happened?" "Victor convinced his father to target them," Clara continued, her voice trembling. "They pushed your grandparents out with dirty tactics, legal loopholes, intimidation. It broke your mother's heart. She swore she'd never forgive them. Ophelia's chest tightened as the pieces began to fit together. That's why my mother started this shop. She wanted to rebuild what they took from her. Clara nodded. And now Victor's doing it again. Only this time, it's personal. He knows who you are, Ophelia. He knows what this place means to you, and to her. The revelation left Ophelia stunned. She stared at the folder, unsure if she wanted to open it. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? I thought it was buried in the past, Clara admitted. But seeing what they're doing now, I realized I couldn't stay silent. You deserve to know the truth. Ophelia's mind raced. The fight against Whitaker Industries had always felt personal, but now she understood why. This wasn't just about profit, it was about revenge. Meanwhile, across town, Thorne stood in his father's office once again, the tension between them thicker than ever. Victor leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk playing on his lips. You've been spending a lot of time in that flower shop, Victor said, his tone deceptively casual. Thorne kept his expression neutral. I've been gathering information. Victor raised an eyebrow. And what have you gathered? Thorne hesitated, his mind replaying the moments he'd spent with Ophelia. Her passion, her determination. It was impossible to ignore. She's not going to back down. Of course not, Victor said with a chuckle. She's just like her mother. Thorne stiffened. What do you mean? Victor's smirk widened. Didn't she tell you? Her mother and I have history. Let's just say the Marlowe family has always been a thorn in my side. Thorne's jaw tightened. This isn't about business, is it? This is personal. Victor leaned forward, his tone hardening. Everything is personal, Thorne. You'd do well to remember that. Thorne left the office with his father's cryptic words ringing in his ears. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than Victor had let on. For the first time, he found himself questioning not just his father's motives, but his own role in this battle. Back at Bloomhaven, Ophelia finally opened the folder Clara had left behind. Inside were old photographs, legal documents, and faded newspaper clippings detailing the Whitakers' tactics from decades ago. Among them was a photo of her mother standing in front of the apothecary, her expression one of quiet defiance. Tears blurred Ophelia's vision as she traced her mother's face with trembling fingers. The fight she was waging now wasn't just hers. It was a continuation of her mother's legacy. And she wasn't about to let Victor Whitaker win. As the night deepened, Ophelia placed the folder in a drawer, her resolve hardening. This wasn't just about saving Bloomhaven anymore. It was about justice, for her family, her community, and herself. The shadows of the past had come to light, and Ophelia knew they would shape the battle ahead. Thorne sat in the library of the Whitaker estate, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room. The room's dark wood paneling and shelves of leather-bound books felt oppressive, mirroring the weight in his chest. He'd spent hours combing through old company records, spurred by his father's cryptic comments about the Marlowe family. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he couldn't ignore the growing suspicion that the rivalry was far more personal than he'd been told. Finally, he found it, a folder tucked away in the back of a cabinet marked historical accounts. Inside were faded documents, letters, contracts, and legal filings that painted a damning picture. The Whitakers had forced the Marlowe family out of their apothecary decades ago through a mix of shady legal maneuvers and outright intimidation. Among the papers was a letter, handwritten by Victor Whitaker himself, referring to Ophelia's mother as a naive dreamer who underestimated the cost of crossing us. Thorne's stomach churned as he read. His father's actions weren't just ruthless, they were vindictive. It was clear now that the current redevelopment wasn't just about business. It was about finishing a fight Victor had started years ago. Later that evening, Thorne found himself outside Bloomhaven once again. He hadn't planned to come, but his feet had carried him there before his mind could catch up. The warm glow of the shop's lights spilled onto the sidewalk, a stark contrast to the cold revelations he carried. Inside, Ophelia was arranging a bouquet of wildflowers, her fingers moving with practiced ease. She looked up when the doorbell chimed, her expression shifting from surprise to cautious curiosity. "Thorne," she said, setting down the bouquet. "This is becoming a habit." He He gave a small, rueful smile. I needed to talk to you. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she nodded toward a chair near the counter. All right, I'm listening. Thorne sat, running a hand through his hair as he searched for the right words. I've been looking into my father's dealings, both now and in the past, and I found something disturbing. Ophelia folded her arms, her expression guarded. Go on. Your mother's apothecary. My family, my father, forced them out. It wasn't just business. It was deliberate, personal, and now it's happening again. His voice was tight with frustration and guilt. Ophelia stared at him, her face unreadable. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to know the truth, he said, meeting her gaze. And because I'm not proud of what my family has done. Her defenses softened slightly as she studied him. And what about now? Are you going to let it happen again? Thorne exhaled, leaning forward. I don't want to, but it's complicated. My father controls everything. My career, my reputation. I've spent my entire life trying to meet his expectations, to be the son he wants. But now I'm starting to wonder if it's worth it. Ophelia's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. She wanted to trust him, but years of battling the Whitakers had taught her to be cautious. It sounds like you already know the answer to that. It's not that simple, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. If I turn against him, I lose everything. But if I don't, I lose myself. For a moment, the shop was silent except for the soft rustle of petals in the breeze. Ophelia moved to the workbench and picked up a single bloom, a daisy, and handed it to him. Do you know what this means? She asked. Thorne shook his head, his fingers closing around the delicate stem. New beginnings, she said. Maybe it's time for yours. Her words hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Thorne looked at the daisy in his hand, the simple flower carrying more weight than he could have imagined. For the first time, he saw a glimpse of a different path, one that wasn't defined by his father's shadow. The conversation stretched late into the night as they shared pieces of themselves they hadn't revealed to anyone else. Ophelia spoke of her mother's dreams and the pain of losing her, while Thorne admitted to the suffocating pressure of being a Whitaker. I've spent so much time trying to live up to a name, he said quietly, but I think I've forgotten how to live for myself. Ophelia's gaze softened, and she reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. You don't have to figure it out alone, Thorne, but you do have to decide who you want to be. The touch of her hand sent a warmth through him that he hadn't felt in years, a sense of connection, of hope. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. As the clock struck midnight, Thorne stood to leave. Thank you, he said, his voice sincere, for listening, and for everything. Ophelia nodded, her heart conflicted but her resolve unwavering. Good night, Thorne. As he stepped out into the cool night air, Thorne looked back at the shop, the light spilling onto the street like a beacon. He clutched the daisy in his hand, its fragile strength a reminder of the choice he had to make. Inside, Ophelia watched him go, her thoughts a tangle of emotions. She didn't know if she could trust him fully, but for the first time, she saw the possibility of change, not just in him, but in the battle ahead. The seeds of something new had been planted. Now, it was only a matter of whether they would bloom. The morning light spilled into Thorne's office at Whitaker Industries, illuminating the stacks of documents he'd left untouched. His mind was elsewhere, tangled in the events of the previous night. Ophelia's words played on a loop in his head. You don't have to figure it out alone, but you do have to decide who you want to be. He turned the small daisy over in his hand, its petals now slightly wilted but still intact. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, and his assistant, Martin, stepped in, his expression tense. Your father wants to see you, Martin said. Now. Thorne sighed, the weight of inevitability settling over him. I'll be there. Victor Whitaker was already seated when Thorne entered his office, his posture rigid and his eyes as sharp as ever. The office, with its cold marble floors and sprawling views of Savannah, reflected the man himself, calculated and unyielding. You've been busy, Victor began, his voice low but laced with accusation. Thorne stayed silent, knowing better than to speak first. Victor rose, pulling a file from his desk and tossing it onto the table between them. It was filled with surveillance photos of Thorne at Bloomhaven, speaking with Ophelia, helping her arrange flowers, even attending the block party. "You're fraternizing with the enemy," Victor said, his voice hardening. "And it's starting to make me question where your loyalties lie." Thorne met his father's glare. "She's not the enemy. She's a person. A person whose life you're trying to destroy for a grudge you should have let go of decades ago." Victor's expression darkened. "This isn't about a grudge. It's about protecting our legacy. That woman and her mother tried to stand in our way, and I won't let it happen again." Thorne's jaw tightened. "You've already won. You forced her family out once. Why do you need to do it again? What does crushing her shop really accomplish?" "It sends a message," Victor snapped, "that no one, no matter how small or insignificant, can defy us." Thorne leaned forward, his voice steady but filled with quiet defiance. "If this is what our legacy is built on, then maybe it's not worth protecting." Victor's eyes narrowed, the room crackling with tension. "Be very careful, Thorne. You've been handed everything. Your position, your power, your future. Don't throw it all away for some florist." Thorne stood, his fists clenched at his sides. "Maybe I want a future I can actually be proud of." Victor's voice turned icy. "If you walk away from this family, from this company, you'll lose everything. No money, no connections. You'll be nothing." Thorne paused, the enormity of the threat sinking in. But then he thought of Ophelia, of the community she fought so fiercely to protect, of the person he wanted to become. He straightened his shoulders. "Then I guess I'll have to find out who I am without all of it." Victor didn't respond, his silence more chilling than words. Thorne turned and left, the sound of the door closing behind him echoing in his ears. At Bloomhaven, Ophelia was preparing for another day when Ellie rushed in, her face flushed with excitement and worry. "Ophelia, you need to see this," Ellie said, holding up her phone. Ophelia frowned as she took the device. On the screen was a local news article featuring Thorne Whitaker. The headline read, "Whitaker heir opposes family project, pledges support for local community." Her breath caught as she read Thorne's statement. "The redevelopment project in Savannah's historic district is not aligned with the values we should stand for. I cannot in good conscience support something that dismantles the fabric of a community for the sake of profit. I stand with the residents fighting to protect their home." Ellie grinned. "He's on our side." Ophelia set the phone down, her emotions a whirlwind of disbelief, gratitude, and uncertainty. "It's a bold move," she said cautiously, "but I don't know if it's enough." Later that day, Thorne arrived at the shop, the tension between him and Ophelia palpable. She stood behind the counter, her arms crossed as he approached. "So, you've gone public," she said, her tone measured. He nodded. "I couldn't stand by anymore. I needed to make a choice." "And you chose us?" she asked, her voice tinged with skepticism. "Or did you just choose to spite your father?" Thorne's gaze softened. "I chose what felt right. For once." Ophelia studied him, searching his expression for any sign of doubt or duplicity. "You're risking everything for this." "Why?" "Because I believe in what you're fighting for," he said, his voice steady. "And because I want to be someone worth believing in." Her defenses wavered, but she wasn't ready to let them fall entirely. "This isn't just about words, Thorne. Actions matter." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm here. To help if you'll let me." Ophelia hesitated, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Trusting Thorne felt like stepping into unknown territory, but his sincerity was hard to ignore. "All right," she said finally. "But if you're in this, you're in it all the way. No backing out when it gets hard." Thorne nodded, a small smile breaking through his serious demeanor. All the way. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Thorne's public statement sparked a media frenzy, drawing attention to the redevelopment battle in ways Ophelia hadn't anticipated. Reporters flocked to Bloomhaven, and donations began pouring in to support the community's legal fund. But Victor wasn't going down without a fight. Anonymous threats and smear campaigns escalated, putting more pressure on Ophelia and the neighborhood. Through it all, Thorne remained by her side, using his insider knowledge to counter his father's moves and rally support. As the two of them worked late one evening, piecing together strategies and sorting through paperwork, Ophelia glanced at Thorn. "You know this is just the beginning, right? Your father isn't going to let up." "I know," Thorn said, meeting her gaze. "But I'm not afraid of him anymore." Her lips curved into a small smile. "Good. Because neither am I." The line between ally and something more blurred further as they shared a quiet moment, their resolve growing stronger with every passing day. Together, they were drawing new lines, not just against Victor Whitaker, but for the future they both wanted to create. The Savannah Flower Festival was always a vibrant celebration of the city's rich history and natural beauty, but this year, the stakes were higher. The usually lighthearted event had transformed into a rallying cry for the community to save what mattered most. Ophelia had poured her heart into organizing it, determined to use the gathering as a platform to unify her neighbors and make their voices impossible to ignore. Bloomhaven stood at the center of it all, its exterior draped in garlands of magnolias and daisies, while the cobblestone streets overflowed with booths selling handcrafted goods and floral arrangements. Children ran laughing between stalls, and the air buzzed with hope and purpose. Ophelia stood near the main stage, her clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. Despite the festive atmosphere, nerves twisted in her stomach. The speech she had prepared weighed heavily on her, its importance underscored by the battles they'd fought to get here. Ellie appeared at her side, her hands full of flyers. "The turnout is incredible," she said, grinning. "I think we've got half the city here." Ophelia nodded, her eyes scanning the crowd. "Let's hope it's enough." Across the festival, Thorn walked through the bustling streets, his presence drawing curious glances. He wasn't the polished, untouchable figure people had seen in press photos. His sleeves were rolled up, and his expression was earnest as he stopped to speak with vendors and neighbors, listening to their concerns and sharing his plans for change. Though many were still skeptical, the sincerity in his voice and the quiet determination in his eyes began to chip away at their distrust. For the first time, Thorn felt like he was part of something real, something that mattered. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the festival, Ophelia stepped onto the stage. The crowd gathered before her, a sea of familiar faces interspersed with strangers who had come to lend their support. She took a deep breath, the microphone trembling slightly in her hand. "When my mother started Bloomhaven," she began, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart, "she told me something I've never forgotten. Flowers are like people. They bloom when they're rooted in care and community." This shop wasn't just her dream. It was her way of giving back to a place that gave her so much. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "But this isn't just about my shop. It's about all of us. It's about preserving the history, the humanity, and the heart of this neighborhood. It's about saying no to greed and yes to a future we can all be proud of." Her words were met with cheers and applause, the sound washing over her like a wave. She felt the knot in her chest loosen as the crowd's energy buoyed her. Thorn watched from the edge of the crowd, his chest tightening with a mixture of pride and resolve. When the applause quieted, he stepped forward, making his way to the stage. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as he climbed the steps, standing beside Ophelia. He took the microphone, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "For most of my life, I've been part of the problem. I've stood by while my family put profits above people, and I've let fear keep me from speaking up. But no more." The crowd hushed, leaning in as he continued. "I'm here to say that I'm leaving Whitaker Industries. Effective immediately, I'm stepping down from my role in the company. I can no longer be part of something that destroys what others have worked so hard to build." Gasps rippled through the audience. But Thorn wasn't finished. "And more than that, I've convinced our board to repurpose several properties acquired in the redevelopment project into spaces that will benefit the community, gardens, parks, and affordable spaces for small businesses. It's not enough to stop the damage. We have to repair it." The crowd erupted in applause, the sound reverberating through the festival. Thorn glanced at Ophelia, whose expression was a mixture of shock and gratitude. She stepped closer, her voice steady as she took the microphone back. "Change doesn't come easy," she said, looking directly at Thorn. "But it starts with moments like this. with choices like his. Let this be the beginning of something new, something better. Together, we can protect what matters. The crowd cheered again, their unity palpable. As the applause began to fade, someone started singing an old folk tune, and soon others joined in. The melody filled the air, a fitting backdrop to the moment of triumph. As the festival wound down, Ophelia found Thorn near the back of the stage, his hands resting on the railing as he watched the sunset. She approached quietly, her heart full but conflicted. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. He turned to her, his expression serious. "Yes, I did. It was the right thing to do." Ophelia studied him, her walls finally beginning to lower. "You've changed. Because of you," he admitted. "You showed me what it means to stand for something." She smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. "And now you're standing with us." He reached out, his hand brushing hers. The touch was light but meaningful, a silent acknowledgement of all they had been through. "Thank you, Thorn," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For what?" he asked. "For choosing to bloom where it matters most." They stood in silence as the last light of the day faded, the festival continuing around them. It wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a victory, a step toward the future they both wanted to create. The festival's glow had barely faded when the storm rolled in. The community's joy and unity felt like a distant memory as Ophelia sat in Bloomhaven's back office, a thick stack of legal documents spread across her desk. Her hands trembled as she read through the language designed to intimidate and overwhelm. Victor Whitaker wasn't backing down. The papers threatened an immediate injunction against Bloomhaven, claiming the shop was in violation of zoning laws and encroaching on property acquired by Whitaker Industries. The implications were devastating: fines, forced closure, and the possibility of losing everything. Ellie stood nearby, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "This can't be legal. He's just trying to scare you." Ophelia pressed her fingers to her temples, the weight of it all crashing down. "Scaring me is working." The door to the shop creaked open, and Thorn entered, his expression grim. He carried a similar stack of papers under his arm, his jaw set in frustration. "I just got these," he said, dropping the documents onto the desk. "He's coming after me too, revoking my access to company resources, freezing my accounts. He's cutting me off completely." Ophelia looked up, her heart aching at the sight of him. "I'm sorry, Thorn. This is my fight. You shouldn't be dragged into it." He shook his head. "This isn't just your fight anymore. I made my choice and I'm not backing down." She met his gaze, searching for reassurance, but finding only the same uncertainty that plagued her. "What do we do now?" For a moment, neither of them spoke, the room heavy with silence. Finally, Thorn sighed and sat down across from her. "We regroup. We don't let him see us break. But what if we can't win?" Her voice cracked, the vulnerability she kept hidden slipping through. "What if he takes everything?" Thorn leaned forward, his hand covering hers. "He can take the shop, the money, whatever he wants. But he can't take who you are, Ophelia. He can't take what you mean to this community." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, unwilling to let despair win. "It's just hard to keep fighting when everything feels stacked against you." "I know," he said softly, "but you're not alone in this." The next morning brought no relief. The news of Victor's legal actions had spread quickly, and fear rippled through the neighborhood. Some supporters began to waver, unsure if they could afford to stand against such a powerful opponent. Others rallied, their anger sparking new determination. Ophelia stood at the counter, watching as Mrs. Clara entered with a determined stride. "You're not giving up, are you?" the older woman demanded. "No," Ophelia replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "Good. Because we're not giving up on you," Clara said firmly. "Victor Whitaker may have money, but he doesn't have heart. And that's what's going to win this." As the day dragged on, the weight of the situation bore down on Ophelia and Thorn. Every phone call and meeting felt like an uphill battle, and doubt crept in like a cold draft. Late in the evening, as they sat in the now-empty shop, Thorn broke the silence. "Do you remember what you said at the festival?" he asked, his voice quiet. She looked up, exhausted. "I said a lot of things. You said this wasn't just about saving the shop. It's about preserving the heart of this community. He paused, his gaze steady. Victor doesn't understand that. He thinks this is about money and power. But we have something he'll never have. People who care. Ophelia managed a faint smile. You're starting to sound like a believer. I've had a good teacher, he said, his lips curving into a soft smile. For a moment, the heaviness lifted, replaced by a fragile hope. They didn't have all the answers, but they had each other, and the fight wasn't over yet. The days that followed Victor's legal assault on Bloomhaven were some of the most trying Ophelia had ever faced. Yet, amidst the growing pressure, something remarkable began to happen. The community rallied. It started with Mrs. Clara, who organized a meeting at the local church. Word spread quickly, and soon the room was packed with neighbors offering ideas, resources, and, most importantly, support. Some pledged funds to cover legal fees. Others volunteered their time to raise awareness about Victor's tactics. I don't have much, said Mr. Benton, who had been on the verge of selling his shop to Whitaker Industries. But I've got connections at the Historical Society. Maybe they can help make this place untouchable. Ophelia's heart swelled at the outpouring of generosity. For every moment of despair, there was a reminder of why she was fighting. Thorne worked tirelessly behind the scenes, spending long nights in his modest new apartment, poring over company records he had managed to access before Victor locked him out. His determination to expose the truth burned brighter with each passing day. One evening, as he flipped through an older file labeled Special Acquisitions, a phrase caught his eye. Non-disclosure penalties for improper land use. Intrigued, he read further and discovered a series of payments made to silence complaints about environmental damage caused by Whitaker Industries. Among the documents were letters from Victor himself, approving hush-money settlements to cover up unsafe practices. Thorne felt a mix of anger and vindication. This wasn't just unethical, it was illegal, and it might be the leverage they needed to stop him. At Bloomhaven, Ophelia was tending to an arrangement of magnolias and dahlias when Thorne burst through the door, a folder clutched in his hand. His expression was a mix of triumph and urgency. I found it, he said, setting the folder on the counter. Proof that my father's been covering up environmental violations. If we release this, he'll have no choice but to back off. Ophelia stared at the papers, her hands trembling. This could ruin him. Thorne nodded. It could. But it'll also save this shop and this neighborhood. For a moment, she hesitated. The thought of striking back with such force was daunting. But then she remembered her mother's apothecary, the pain of watching history repeat itself. She looked at Thorne, her resolve hardening. Let's do it. With the help of a trusted journalist from the local newspaper, the documents were leaked. The expose hit the front page within days, detailing Whitaker Industries' history of environmental harm and unethical practices. The backlash was swift and fierce. Protests erupted outside the Whitaker offices, and investors began pulling out. Victor's response was predictably furious. He denied the allegations and dismissed the reports as sensationalized lies. But behind closed doors, he faced mounting pressure from shareholders to step down. For the first time, Victor Whitaker was on the defensive. The following week, Bloomhaven hosted a community gathering to celebrate the small but significant victory. Neighbors filled the shop and spilled out onto the sidewalk, their laughter and chatter a stark contrast to the tension that had lingered just days before. Thorne stood beside Ophelia, watching the scene with a rare sense of peace. I think you're winning them over, he said with a smile. Ophelia glanced at him, her expression softening. Not just me. Us. As the evening wore on, Thorne pulled her aside. I have something to show you, he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. She followed him a few blocks to an empty lot that had once been a decrepit building owned by Whitaker Industries. Now, the space had been transformed. Rows of flowers bordered newly planted trees, and a sign at the entrance read, "The Marlowe Garden, dedicated to the memory of Rose Marlowe." Ophelia's breath caught as she took in the sight. Thorne, you did this? He nodded. I wanted to honor her. And you. This place is about more than a fight. It's about growth, renewal. I thought it could be a reminder of what you're saving. Tears welled in her eyes as she turned to him. It's beautiful. Thank you. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their journey settling between them. Then, without hesitation, Ophelia stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him. Thorn held her tightly, his own emotions threatening to spill over. "You've changed everything," she whispered. "So have you," he replied. The Marlowe Garden quickly became a symbol of hope for the neighborhood, a place where people gathered to celebrate, reflect, and dream. And though the fight against Whitaker Industries wasn't entirely over, the tides had turned. With the community united and Victor's power waning, the future felt brighter than it had in a long time. The Savannah Flower Festival reached its crescendo as night fell, transforming the streets into a sea of lights and laughter. Strings of twinkling bulbs crisscrossed the cobblestone square, casting a soft glow over the festivities. The sweet scent of flowers mingled with the cool evening breeze, creating an atmosphere that felt almost magical. Ophelia stood near the center of the square, watching as children darted between booths and couples strolled hand in hand. The day had been a celebration not just of blooms, but of resilience, unity, and the power of a community standing together. It was a victory that had been hard-won, and the joy radiating around her was proof of its impact. Lost in thought again? Thorn's voice came from behind her, warm and familiar. She turned, a smile spreading across her face as she saw him. He looked different tonight, relaxed, lighter, as though the weight of his past had finally begun to lift. "Just soaking it all in," she replied. He stepped closer, his hands in his pockets. "You should. This is your moment, Ophelia. You made this happen." "Not alone," she said, her eyes meeting his. "We made it happen." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the sounds of the festival surrounding them. Then, a soft melody began to play, drifting through the square. It was a waltz, simple and elegant, and the crowd parted slightly as couples moved to the makeshift dance floor. Thorn extended a hand toward her, a playful glint in his eye. "Dance with me?" Ophelia hesitated, a blush rising to her cheeks. "I'm not much of a dancer." "Neither am I," he admitted with a grin. "But I think we'll manage." She laughed softly, placing her hand in his. He led her to the center of the square, the lights above them casting a soft halo as they moved together. His hand rested lightly on her waist, hers on his shoulder, and they swayed to the rhythm of the music. For a moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them. The challenges they had faced, the battles they had fought, it all faded, replaced by the quiet intimacy of the moment. "You know," Thorn said, his voice low, "I didn't think this was possible, finding something worth fighting for. But you've changed everything." Ophelia looked up at him, her heart full. "And you've reminded me that even in the hardest fights, there's room for hope, for love." He smiled, leaning closer. "So what do we do now, Miss Marlowe?" She tilted her head, a teasing glint in her eye. "We keep blooming. Together." As the song reached its crescendo, petals began to fall from above. Delicate magnolias, daisies, and roses drifting down like a blessing from the heavens. The crowd cheered and clapped, their joy palpable. Thorn leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "You taught me what it means to grow, and you taught me to believe in second chances," she whispered. Their lips met in a soft, tender kiss, sealing not just their love but the promise of a brighter future. Around them, the festival continued, but in that moment, it was just the two of them. Under the magnolia lights, surrounded by hope and renewal. As they pulled apart, Ophelia laughed softly, her eyes sparkling. "I think this is the start of something beautiful." "It already is," Thorn replied, his voice filled with certainty. Hand in hand, they stepped off the dance floor, ready to face whatever came next, together.